Hello, everybody. How are you doing? Looks like 90% people who were at the opening keynote also showed up here. That's a good number for the closing keynote. Usually people are tired or they have something to do, so they just leave. So I see a lot of faces here, right? At least 300 people, 350 people. So that's a good number. Good sign for the closing keynote speaker, right? That's my first keynote speaking, so I'm a little bit nervous, but seeing the audience, it gives some motivation as well. So uh, yeah, I think you all had a fantastic day. You learned about a lot of new stuff in DevOps, right? Processes, tools, best practices, what to do, what to not to do, what not to do, and all that thing, right? So I think that the lot of information is just circulating in your head, right? Isn't that the case? I assume so. I mean, that's the whole purpose of getting together in such a setup and then uh, talk to people who has been doing DevOps practices at their company and also networking with each other and learning from each other. That's the whole purpose of it. So I like such a kind of a setup. Having this, and it's my first time in Vilnius, and there's a lovely community here. So thank you for having us here. Uh, yeah, so let's begin. What I'm going to be talking about. So I assume that many of you are doing DevOps, or some of them are starting to do DevOps, or some are thinking to start doing a DevOps and all that thing. So that means uh, you are going to begin your DevOps journey because the advantages of DevOps are not unknown, right? Everybody knows about it. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to talk about the 4 quadrants of DevOps maturity model, basically telling you where do you stand if you are already doing DevOps, or what do you consider, what should you consider if you are going to start your DevOps journey, right? So first of all, very quick thing about me. I already spoken in a video. Voice was not so great, but I think that's okay. I currently work for a company called CloudPeace, which is making Jenkins, which is company behind Jenkins. We make some enterprise tool around Jenkins. So who among the audience using Jenkins? Just raise your hand very quickly. I think, yeah, that's a pretty encouraging number. Around 80% people are using Jenkins, right? So yeah, apart from just as I work as a solution architect at CloudPeace, but I also work for a various company in a various different capacity as mentioned. So that's about me. So interesting thing is what I'll be talking about right now, right? Uh, I'll be talking about when you approach your DevOps journey, how should you do it? And then kind of give you a model that if you want to approach, there has to be also some structure. So we at CloudBees have 4 quadrants of DevOps maturity model. So this is basically a model for communicating, for establishing a communication language for people within the organization, different departments, how they communicate with each other, for example, operations or development or QA, IT, and others, right? How do you communicate with each other so you can better address the very important topic called DevOps, and also eventually you become successful. So that's an idea. We'll also look into a couple of adoption patterns, and we'll also look at how the couple of adoption cycles look like if you are starting your DevOps journey based on our experience at CloudPeace, right? And trying to give you one example, what should be the mapping strategy, right? So that's about it. But before we begin, right, let me just take a very quick poll because there are a lot of people in here and I'm just enticed to do one quick poll. Most of you are already using Slido with this. I see that many people are asking questions. So let's do a very quick poll. You have Slido open, or perhaps you're running it. Just answer this question, and we'll see. It's a live poll, so you will see the interaction. What you are doing is just getting visible on your screen, right? I'll run it for around 20 seconds, and we'll have a result. So yeah, that's what I'm expecting. Developers, IT operations, QA person, people and process managers as well. So good mix of audience are here, but we'll see the right number here, right? So that also tells us that how much, what kind of audience that such conferences are gathering around. So I think it's number is pretty much in favor of developers, 49%, 51% increasing, and so on and so forth. So I think that gives a kind of a perspective that, okay, we do have some managers here as well. Interesting, right? So I wonder that when talking about Docker security and talking about the kind of implementation of a Docker in C++, one of the fellow speaker did that, how that would be interesting for managers. So yeah, interesting, right? So I'm going to pause this poll for now. But it's interesting that developers is the majority community here, followed by the IT operations and the hybrid role as well. What is called, it's not visible on the screen, unfortunately, right? So let me Unfortunately, I can't scroll down, so I'm just stopping it here. But looks like we have a good number of people, mixed audience in here. So very quickly moving down after knowing the audience, the DevOps journey is kind of it involves a different part of an organization, right? So when you begin, you often are like on a road. The road is not going to be straight. As you know, there are a lot of questions are unanswered. There are a lot of technologies are there. There are a lot of processes, best practices, everything exists. So if you are working at a company responsible or somehow associated with the DevOps transformation, the thing is not going to be very much easier. The road will be pretty much zigzag, right? I would like to bring one metaphor here, which is a very old metaphor from the one that exists in many of the Asian cultures: the blind man and an elephant, right? Once upon a time, there was one elephant, and set of blind men were just asked to experience the elephant, right? So feel and touch. So they couldn't see, so they just have to touch and feel it, and then describe what they have experienced, right? So blindness were put in front of elephant. Everybody was touching whatever that's coming in front of them, trunk or tail or leg or chest or ears or whatsoever, right? And then they were asked, what do you feel about, what does elephant look like, right? So somebody was saying, oh, it was very thick. Somebody said it was pointed, because probably it's talking about teeth. Somebody said, okay, it's a long thing with some hairish kind of stuff at the end. So point is, everybody was just talking about their own experiences, how they learn about that particular subject, right? That is an elephant in this case. Same applies for DevOps as well, right? If your managers have gone to some conferences, some agile conferences, he will come back and say that DevOps is all about collaboration, agile methodology. It's about Kanban and within the operation teams, right? Because this is how you respond faster. If you talk about developers, he will say this is all about feature toggle, right? And if you talk about DevOps engineer, automation, infrastructure as a code and stuff like that, different people, different perspective, also belongs to their domain that they are expert in. So we are kind of leaning towards the more comfortable subject that we are having, right? None of those answers are incorrect, but none of those answers are complete as well, right? It really depends on the perception. So the point being is that those technologies, those tools and processes, you need to think beyond that. And when you start thinking about after finishing such a conference, and then you're going to start reflecting, you probably, when you start writing down all those things that you might have learned, probably this will be the cloud of words that you will face, right? We will call it like a DevOps word soup. Processes, tools, this and that and that not. So it's a pretty complicated subject, right? This is so mind-boggling and at the same time overwhelming that you'll think, okay, I learned a lot of things, but now I don't remember what I'm going to start with, right? So that's the whole purpose. We need to come up with the way where if you want to do DevOps, because there are certain advantages, you need to start from somewhere. How to start, right? So you need to simplify. Then simple can be harder than complex. You have to work hard to get your thinking clean to make it simple, right? This is said by Steve Jobs, because he says that once you're done that, it is worth, because once you get there, you can move mountains. That means, in other words, you can achieve anything you want to do it. So key is to simplify. Do not look at a complex picture. Do not look at the scope which are out there, because the scope might not be fitting into your work culture, not fitting into your organization. So you need to simplify and think about whether whatever you are going to do, whether it's adoption of Docker, whether it's adoption of Agile, whether it's adoption of a cloud, or any other topic associated with DevOps, whether they really make sense for you. Do you really want it? If so, what are the advantages it is bringing to your business, your company, and what are the changes that will drive the culture within your company, right? So that's the whole purpose. So key is to simplify. And simplification can come when you ask very easy questions. For example, where we are, right? Where are we standing right now? Where are we going? Where do we want to go, right? In the future, next 6 months, next 1 year, 1.5 years, where you want to go? What's your ultimate goal? It might be 500 deployments a day, like as GitHub mentioned, or it might be changing a culture. So people from different organizations or part of the company can also collaborate very well. So we have seen that example as well. Or it might be adopting some particular technologies like Kubernetes, right? Or it might be just about breaking a silo so people can work together very well. So all those things, what are the most important things that you would like to address first. Some lower hanging fruits, right, where you can make a low impact, which is having a low impact, but that impact will go a long way because it will be setting up an example which you can then scale out, right? So where do you want to go? And then other very important question is how to get there. Now that's the most difficult question to answer, but when you start asking those questions in a subjective manner, you will be able to get an answer which will probably help you to navigate through your DevOps journey. We are being asked as a cloud beast, as a business, we are being asked a lot of these questions because we are selling a CI/CD solution on top of open source Jenkins. So many customers who coming to us are asking that, hey, we want to do DevOps. Now suddenly we have a budget, we have people as well. So can we do DevOps in 6 months? So we said, okay, this is not an easy thing. Even if you have money, if you have people, and if you have tools, this is not going to make you one of the Googles or one of the GitHub or Amazons, right? You need to really understand what you want, how you want to get there, and what are the practices or impact that you want to bring to your business out of this practice, right? So this was not an easy conversation every now and then. So a couple of years ago, we developed an internal model to communicate to our customers, and that's what the DevOps maturity quadrants are. So I'm going to be briefly talking about it. It's a very abstract model, right? It's a simplified and very abstract model for assessing and discussing DevOps transformation. So if you are a developer discussing, hey, to your manager, we want to do a DevOps transformation, this model should help. If you are a manager and want to talk to your VP of engineering who oversees development as well as operation, you should be able to use this model to communicate from middle level management to upper management. Even if you're a developer, you should be able to explain this to your CTO using this model. So that's the kind of a goal that we want to give a common terminology or set of communicating rule that resonates with everybody, right? If I talk about infrastructure as a core, as IT operation guy or DevOps engineer, I'll understand that, but my CEO or CTO might not understand it, right? If I talk about Agile and Kanban, managers or Scrum Masters will understand it, but not the half of the development community, nor the operation people will care about it, right? So we really need to find a kind of a communication ground where we all stand, and that's the kind of a high-level goal for it. Now, how successful we are, it's a very subjective, depends on the customer or depend on your organization that you are standing. So it's a very subjective model as well. It's derived from the real world example. This is basically coming out of the conversations that we are having with our customers, as well as some of the people that we hired who are doing consulting, solution engineering with a variety of customers across the domains, right? So this is basically model outcome of that set of communications. It's a flexible model, so you can basically turn it apart, put your specific stuff inside, but there are some base DNA for that model. So it has some core principle which allows you to do a subjective definition of maturity, right? It's an extensible as well. So as I said, you can turn it apart, put your own stuff in it, and then you can take this model and apply it to your organization. So without further ado, let's go into it, right? As it's a quadrant, so you can imagine 4 quadrants of a circle or 4 quadrants of any shape that you can imagine. So let's start with the x-axis, right? Because it's a quadrant, so it has got to have like x-axis and y-axis. So x-axis is basically which move along the software development lifecycle from define to plan, code, build, integrate, test, release, deploy, and operate. Now, deploy is very subjective. If you are having a product releases, you might not be doing a deployment, but you are just delivering your software to your end customer. Right? So it's a very subjective, but the terminology is same. It's a continuous delivery. That's in here. So and then it's further divided into 2 somewhere in the middle, right? And what we call it agile upstream and then agile downstream. When we and then agile, what does it mean by agile upstream? That means agile. The teams are doing agile upstream, agile practices. So they have agile practices. They have a regular sprint, daily stand-ups. They are living and breathing the agile methodology, not by manifesto, but very flexible manner that suits to their organization, doing continuous integration. So every single code commit has been tested and built immediately and before it goes further into food chain. And then That's basically it. That's agile upstream, and they are delivering features at the regular interval, not like 3 months or 6 months or 9 months, but the time of the sprint that they are having. So that's agile upstream. When we ask that, how many teams to a customer, when we ask that, how many of your teams are doing agile upstream? So number was kind of plastic. Okay, 33% of teams are doing continuous integration. They are testing every single change that they are having, right? When we ask the same question to the other, which is basically other side, right side of the quadrant, which usually comprises of IT operations, shared services tools, as well as QA department. When how are you doing in agile practices to your teams? Then the answer was 13%, right? So that tells that the agile and all the other processes, they are not very much adopted at that right side of the quadrant, right? Now this looks okay because you will see that, okay, how does it matter? Because my developers are still developing faster, so features are going out, right? But if you revert the picture, then you'll get kind of an idea that, okay, your developers are faster, they are developing in weeks and days, and in some cases in hours as well. But if right side of your organization is not adopting those practices, or not having automation, not having continuous delivery practices implied, that means it will have some implication, and that implications mean that they will move very slow. They will have hard time to deliver something to the customer. So despite your development bits are ready to go to customer or to your end users, your right side of your organization is probably coming in a way of not doing that. And that often means the time to market is quite wide, sometimes in cases of months as well. So despite developers doing, or a development team is delivering feature in the sprint time, it will take months before your end users are seeing that feature, right? So that's a very important picture to look at it. Right? And think about it, where does your organization fitting into either in agile upstream or agile downstream? Where are the blockers are there? So once you have that detail, you can work on it, right? So that's an idea here. Now, when we scale those two quadrants from a team level to work group, that means like a business unit, consists of multiple teams or a couple of big teams. From work group also to the enterprise level, to your entire company, right? Doesn't matter how big or small you are, but enterprise-wide, that means like encompassing all global teams, irrespective of their locations as well. So when you scale it up, the picture will start looking a little bit different, because when you scale it, the teams or the companies which were saying that they are doing agile practices, they were in fact doing those agile practices at the limited number of teams, but not at the enterprise-wide. So 22% of enterprises are saying that they are doing agile practices enterprise-wide. So there are some common set of practices which are established in there. Same on the right side, when you scale up the picture, agile downstream, when you scale up to at the enterprise to work group level, that number will start looking even smaller. So GitHub or Amazon Web Services or Google's, who are doing multiple deployments a day, there are very few and fewer enterprises who are doing that, right? Everybody want to go that, because that's where some basic advantage lies of continuous integration, continuous delivery, and DevOps, so-called DevOps processes. It means people who are on that quadrant, on quadrant 4, they are able to innovate much faster. They are also able to respond to the market much faster. So if there is a new requirement or there is a new gap in the market, they can fill it up very easily as compared to their competitive, and that gives them some competitive advantage naturally, right? It also results into the productivity, because you are responding to master much faster. That means if something doesn't work, you will roll it back, you will take it back and then go work on it, and then release the new features, new functionality, or new software that provides more value to your end users, right? And obviously by doing so, you are generating a really good culture within the organizations, which results into employee satisfaction as well as the retention, because when employees are happy, they have some faith in a organization that, okay, we are doing superb, we are doing fine. In the end, we are also helping our end users. So this brings some satisfaction. And that also results sometimes into retention of the talent that you have. People are not just escaping because they found somebody else who is doing a little bit better than your organization, so team are moving on. So that's a very important factor. Now, all those advantages, why people are not doing it. While just 10% of organizations or enterprises are saying that they are doing enterprise level DevOps, right? Well, there is a reason. As Roy in his opening keynote mentioned that when you look at the DevOps transformation, there are always people and culture, processes and practices, and tools and technologies are involved. And there is a disconnect between upstream and downstream, right? I'll just try to visualize in a might way that how it happens. When you talk about developer, this is basically community who wants to move fast, innovate much faster, right? They want to adopt new processes like Agile, Scrum, all those new techniques, which helps them to move faster. They also want to invest into new point tools, right? If there is a new tool coming out, for example, Kubernetes, right? Let's go adopt Kubernetes. It's very easy to say, but for developers, it's a kind of a charming thing to try latest and greatest thing, right? They also adopt tool as a grassroots level. So one guy goes to a conference, he learns about tools, he starts trying it out in his team, and eventually it's start growing. Maybe up to a couple of teams. Sometimes it doesn't go further than a couple of teams, but it starts from there. So this is what developer is, and we should keep on doing that. And they also believe in rapid change. That means fail fast, right? If I want to develop some feature, I want to immediately that feature to go out. So there is a mentality in there. On the other side, right? Now I'm not blaming anybody, but they also have their own concerns. IT operations side, right? QA department. We need to understand that because those guys have to guarantee you certain characteristic of the system, right? Maintain that system because they have a pain to doing it. Uptime. And Roy was mentioning, if things are not breaking away, don't change it, right? So they have to guarantee the uptime of the system. So they're concerned, and this is how they are measured, right? They have to follow some processes. For example, PMBOK or ITIL or waterfall and other processes that they are there for compliance reason, for auditing purposes and all that thing. So even if they want to move faster, those processes are coming in their way. So you need to understand that aspect as well, right? They often believe in to have enterprise class tools, so they cannot just work on some random open source project just born a month ago. They wouldn't like to adopt that because they don't know whether the technology is stable, how is that going to be pan out for the entire organizations. Because if they do try and if they fail, the consequences are much dire for them as compared to developers, right? So they have to live with that. They often rely on the procurement, the enterprise level procurement to get those tools. So they are not having a liberty to try some new tools by themselves as well sometimes. So that's the chasm, that's the deep division that often occurs. So those both sides have their own concerns. They both sides have their way to innovate. So we need to understand those concerns and start working with that, right? And that's what the quadrant model is trying to help you to do that as well up to a certain extent. So quadrant 1, as I said, team level agile. So quadrant 2, team level continuous delivery. Quadrant 3, that is enterprise agile. So agile practices are done at the enterprise level. And then quadrant 4, which is an enterprise DevOps. So that is, by and large, summarizing the characteristic that I just mentioned. Team level agile focuses on CI practices for some teams, right? They have some tools which are federated and standardized. So most of the teams are using that common denominator tool. For example, their favorite quality assurance tool, for example, Sonar, or their favorite CI/CD tools like Jenkins or something like that, right? Which is standardized. Development is often connected from delivery. So developer goes with the box of software, which is in there on the caricature that Johannes used in the morning. And there is a hole that he has to put the software, and then the operation guy will take it up, right? They have waterfall, Scrum approach, so kind of everything mix of it. So that's the quadrant 1. Quadrant 2, where some teams, not 1 or 2 teams, but a couple of teams or more teams, depending on the size of organization, they have a mature continuous delivery processes for some teams, right? Because they have independent release cycle from the core product. So they might release that much often as compared to rest of the organizations. They have improved tool standardization. So there are some set of best practices apart from tool and processes also established there. Development is connected to delivery most of the times, but only specific to those few teams, not the rest of the organization. And some teams are releasing into weeks, days, and some cases in hours as well. So they are doing continuous delivery, what has to be scaled up. So and then if you scale further, this practices from quadrant 2 to quadrant 3, That is the enterprise agile, right? And of course, this is just a scale, so characteristic of quadrant 1 remains the same, but that thing is done at the enterprise level. So not just one or two teams or a couple of off examples are doing that, but the entire organization is following the practices of CI. They are having elastic CI as a services, or some of the best practices and tools are well established, and there is a good level of developer productivity is also there, right? And then quadrant 4, basically, that summarizes it as a pure DevOps organization who are having a mature CD processes for most to all teams. So 99 or 95% of teams are doing or following the same practices. So people are given the same set of tools, same set of infrastructure to do continuous integration and continuous delivery, right? Elastic managed CI/CD environment, development and delivery tools are centralized and also standardized, and most of the teams are releasing with the same cadence within, maybe it could be days, weeks, or hours, right? So that's the basically characteristic of the 4 quadrants. Now you may wonder, or maybe already start mapping in where your organization might stand, right? So when we go often to such a conferences, or me or my colleagues as well, who are presenting such a model to large audience, are often asking these questions that, where do you stand in this organization, right? So we have the kind of a data which is collected over the period of time, around like 2.5 years now. So this is the kind of response that we have, right? When we ask these questions to large audience, they are basically saying that, where do you stand in quadrant 1, quadrant 2, quadrant 3, or quadrant 4, right? So I would like to have to look at this number, and I'm also going to run live poll into Slido, so you can also kind of relate your organization with that. Right, so poll is open to you. You have seen the characteristic of those 4 quadrants. Now think about it, take a little pause, and then say that where your organization is standing, right? And I'll run this poll for some seconds, and we'll see what is the response. It will be just interesting to understand where everybody is standing, right? Not just because we want to prove ourselves superior to each other, but we accept honestly where we are and where we want to go, right? And then we'll figure out how to go there. Wow, my numbers are messed up, but because they are getting sorted up by the number of responses, the larger percentage goes up. Great. So I think looks like many of 103 people already responded, right? So that's a good number for the large audience. So I'm going to stop this poll and then basically say that you are no different than what result that we have been seeing over the period of 2 years, right? The numbers in a quadrant 2 has been increasing quite well. So that's an encouraging sign, because from that quadrant, you can move to quadrant 4 very easily. Now, some teams, handful of teams are already doing such a practices, which you can scale up, right? So not a bad sign for the overall large for the DevOps community, but for those of who you are at the beginning of quadrant 1, obviously there are some challenges in front of you to work out and even eventually jump to the quadrant 4, right? So that's what we are going to talk about next, right? I already asked this question, so I'm not going to do this, but let's look at the adoption pattern based on our experiences, as well as also some of the common knowledge that people are having in the DevOps community. What are the adoption pattern, right? Roy, in his opening keynote, he presented a couple of adoption pattern as well, how you should go about that, right? What I'm going to be talking about is that how people go about it and how many of them were successful, right? How did they do it? So let's look at the pattern number 1, where usually people are, as most of you are, mentioned that on quadrant 1. So that's team level agile. So they are doing agile practices, and then eventually they start doing the agile practices. So this is scale up at the enterprise level. So most of the teams started doing or following the agile practices in the development, as well as also in operation department, right? But mostly in the development side of things. So once many of the teams or most of your teams are doing agile practices, there is already an inherent pressure for operations also to follow up, right? Because if most of the development teams are ready, and if operations are holding up for X, Y, Z reason that we have seen, that's not going to be work out well in order for the organizational the productivity, right? So they will have to come up with some of the kind of methods to support those deliveries. They become successful by providing them elastic infrastructure, cloud, containers, establishing some process to do a continuous deployment, continuous delivery. So eventually that will follow up, right? And once that happens, organizations are moving from quadrant 1 to quadrant 3, and eventually to quadrant 4. So that's the pattern from team level agile to enterprise agile and eventually to DevOps. Similarly, that's another pattern, which is most popular pattern. When we talk to a customer, around like 70% of customers, they said that they are going towards this direction and eventually they would go to quadrant 4. So that means some teams who are already doing continuous delivery, they will scale up those teams. They basically encourage those teams to replicate that success, not just some handful of teams, but the most of the teams within the organization. And then once it is done, implementing agile at enterprise is kind of a very easy thing. So the pattern goes to quadrant 3 and then eventually to quadrant 4, right? So that's the one pattern as well. The other weird pattern that you might find is that sometimes VP of engineering or CTO has a mandate or at least a pressure from the business perspective to adopt a new technology. So suddenly organizations are hearing about the CTO went to conference or talk to some analyst, and then he comes back and say that, okay, we are going to adopt cloud and we have 6 months time, right? So that is bringing a lot of pressure to operation because there is a high pressure from the very top to adopt the new technology. Let's say they adopted a cloud, right? And eventually that forces operations to also provide some infrastructure so they can utilize the cloud capacity which is now available. Earlier there were XYZ reason that people cannot do continuous delivery. Now the reason is going away because there is a cloud. So there is a hope that people will start doing it, right? And that forces people to also do continuous integration first, because you can't do delivery before you do integration. And when you are doing such a thing, you also need to adopt some agile principles as well, right? So that looks a bit weird pattern, but it's there. It's a very low percentages, almost like we hear from one customer actually who is doing that. But just wanted to bring it up here and see this and show you that, okay, this is also possible, right? So those 3 adoption patterns, how do you go about the DevOps journey, right? And there is also adoption cycle, like how the whole thing pans out, right? So one of the approach is the bottom-up approach. So teams start doing agile. That team is doing extremely well. They are able to do or at least deliver their bits much faster, and that team comes into attention of some upper level management, right? VP of engineering or CTO, and he or she eventually start liking that team. So he will say, okay, this team could be an example to scale up. Why don't I give this team as an example, or also replicate those best practices on the team to the rest of my organization? So then executive awareness is basically driving the adoption from quadrant 1 to basically to quadrant 3 and then eventually to quadrant 4. So that's the bottom up approach, right? There is also sometimes top-down approach where it comes that, hey guys, enough is enough. If we are not going to innovate much faster, if we are not going to deliver much faster, we may vanish from the market. So there is a pressure from the very top. It's like a do or die situation. So we need to do that. In that case, the mandates or kind of requirements are coming from the very top, and that is being percolated to work group. And work group can be only successful if some teams are successful, right? So that work group will tell that, okay, a couple of teams who will start doing CI/CD processes, and ultimately we will start replicating that success across the work group. And then from there, move to quadrant 4. So that's a kind of an adoption cycle that also we are seeing, right? So now you've seen some of the examples based on the experience that we have. You might relate these patterns to your DevOps journey as well, if you would like to move along. So this might be your pattern as well, or you might have some different pattern as well, because the technology landscape is also changing quite a bit. Kubernetes has completely redefined how people are going to adopt containers, right? So these are the pattern that is we haven't incorporated yet, but we'll see that thing also coming into coming days and probably months, right? So Now we have seen the adoption pattern. Now what do I do if I have to measure and map? I have a goal clearly to go to quadrant 4, but how do I do this, right? So there are some order of operations or basic operations that you must do in order to reach there. For example, determine your current state and maturity, where you are, and be really, really, really damn honest to yourself, to your teams, to your organizations, that where are you, right? If a couple of teams are doing continuous delivery, you are not in a quadrant 2. Just accept that there has to be a certain percentage which allows you to tell that, okay, you are in quadrant 2. Define your objective, what you want to really achieve. 500 deployments a day, is it something that you would like to have? But you are not in an e-commerce business, or you are not running services, right? So those 500 deployments a day doesn't matter for you. You are developing some product which your customers are installing in their own infrastructure. You are writing a mobile app. So you're not going to do 500 deployments a day on a mobile app, right? Because sometimes you don't have to. Map your journey through all the quadrants. Where are you? How you want to go there according to some of the adoption pattern and adoption cycles that you have seen. And then ultimately the chasm that we mentioned, the deep division. How do you going to work out from those quadrants, right? So that's a kind of a 4-point approach. It's a very high level, very abstract, but during the day, you have learned a lot of technologies and processes. So if you start thinking about those 4 approaches, you will probably also start mapping what you have learned during the day: processes, tools, best practices, technologies, right? You will able to map with those 4 objectives if you establish them. Now, crossing chasms, connecting quadrants, and continuously improving. This is the most important thing, and it's going to be taking a much longer time in your DevOps journey, right? Or the larger part of your DevOps transformation will go into the last step, right? So crossing this chasm, that means like how do you go from one quadrant to another one? One of the best practices that often other speakers and the DevOps evangelists will give you is that you start small. You start with the small project, which you can identify as a low-risk pilot project, and then form a cross-functional red team. I think Roy mentioned this as a tiger team, right? But don't go on the name of the team or whatsoever. Just find a cross-functional team where the different kind of people from the different organizations are part of it, being it developers or IT organizations, security, networkings, and others. So people that team as a whole knows everything about your IT organization, right? And then focus on one pilot project where this team will be working on, and they'll also focus on unifying couple of very important point tools, right? And establish basically plan the how and when you run that pilot project on the set of infrastructure, how are the results are improving, right? And from there on, basically what you need to do is just establish those best practices as an enterprise-wide best practices, and then you go from there. Measure, document, report, and refine. It's a very high-level thing. I'm not going to go into detail because many of the speaker will do, and you will find a lot of literatures and then the talks on internet to find if you would like to. So that's basically the transformation strategy that you have. We do have at CloudBees, we do help our customers to also navigate, because that's what we do as a company. So we have an assessment model, but that assessment model is a bit more granular. It is asking very specific questions, and it's a tool agnostic. So we don't talk about any tool, we don't talk about any processes. Rather, we ask some legitimate question that, hey, from the 4 aspects: people, process, and tools, right? And then based on that, we collect the number, and then that number basically tells you where exactly you are, right? Something like you are high on a processes in quadrant 1, you are low from the people perspective or culture perspective in quadrant 2, something like that, and then the report comes out, which is basically there. It looks like more scientific, but it's a very flexible model, and we encourage our customer to take this from us, adopt it to your organization. So the red team that I talked about, it will take this model and then adopt it to their organization and basically come up with the really good analysis of where do they end and where do they want to go based on the answers they are there. So this is also kind of a KPI that you can measure over the period of time. So also another method how to measure as your DevOps journey progress. So that's basically the assessment from Cloudbeast. But you may or may not need this. So that's a very subjective thing. So that's basically it. Happy maturing. Go from whatever quadrants you are to the ultimate quadrant that you want to go. And that's it. I'll give you this at last.